The moment Maggie Wainwright sat down alone at the edge of the spring gathering, she felt the weight of every single stair in Carterville pressing against her spine like the flat of a cold blade. She had not cried. She refused to cry. Not here, not in front of all these people, not with the fiddle music still playing and the paper lanterns still swaying in the April wind and the whole wide field still buzzing with laughter and the clinking of tin cups. She would not give them the satisfaction. But her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the rough wood of the fence post beside her and stared hard at the dark line of cottonwood trees beyond the creek, because if she looked anywhere else she would see it again. She would see Daniel Greer's arm wrapped around Clara Holt's waist, spinning her in the middle of the clearing where everyone could watch, everyone could see, as if Maggie did not exist at all. As if the last 2 years of her life had been nothing more than a handful of dry dust he had flung from his fingers and forgotten. 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago Daniel had stood in her father's parlor and told her he intended to ask for her hand before the summer. He had said it plainly, with his hat in his hands and his voice steady, and her father had shaken his hand, and Maggie had believed him with every quiet, faithful corner of her heart. And now here was Daniel Greer dancing with Clara Holt, and here was Maggie Wainwright sitting alone against a fence post while the whole town of Carterville watched to see what she would do. She would do nothing. She would sit still and breathe and survive this the way she had survived every hard thing in her 23 years, which was quietly and without asking anyone for help. She did not notice the man who stood at the far end of the field, near the big bonfire where the ranchers had gathered with their whiskey and their talk of cattle prices. She did not see him turn. She did not see him look across the entire length of the gathering, across the fiddle players and the dancing couples and the tables heavy with food, and find her. She did not see the moment he made the decision. She only became aware of him when his boots appeared in the dry grass in front of her, and a voice came down from somewhere above her, low and unhurried, carrying none of the false brightness people use when they pity someone. "Are you all right?" Maggie looked up. The man standing before her was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his coat. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with a jaw that had seen some weather and eyes that were the precise color of creek water in autumn, neither quite brown nor quite green but somewhere between. He held his hat in one hand, and his expression was not curious or pitying or amused. It was simply direct, the way a person looks at someone when they actually want to know the answer to their question. "I am fine," Maggie said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Thank you." "I don't think you are," the man said, and he sat down on the fence rail beside her without being invited, and somehow that was the thing that undid her. Not Daniel dancing with Clara, not the stares of the town. It was this stranger sitting down beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she was worth crossing a field for. Her throat tightened. She looked back at the cottonwood trees. "I don't know you," she said. "No," the man agreed. "Milton Donovan. I ride for the Callaway Ranch. Came in from the northern range 2 days ago." He paused. "I've been watching that fellow dance with the woman in the blue dress for about 20 minutes, and I've been watching you sit here for about the same amount of time. I figured someone ought to come ask." Maggie was quiet for a long moment. "He told me he was going to marry me," she said, and then she was furious with herself for saying it, because she had not meant to say anything at all. Milton Donovan did not say he was sorry. He did not offer her a false consolation or a piece of advice or a word about what a fool that fellow must be. He just said, quietly, "That's a hard thing to discover in a place full of people." And for some reason, that was exactly right. That was exactly the right thing to say. To understand how Maggie Wainwright came to be sitting alone at the edge of the spring gathering in Carterville, Texas, in the year of our Lord 1881, you have to understand what kind of woman she was and what kind of town she lived in. And you have to understand what kind of courage it takes to keep your dignity intact when everything else is falling to pieces around you. Maggie had come to Carterville 7 years earlier, when she was 16 and her father, Thomas Wainwright, had loaded everything they owned into a wagon and driven them south from their failed farm in Kansas, following the promise of land and better soil. Her mother, Louise, had died of a fever the winter before, and it was just Thomas and Maggie and the wagon and a dog named Bishop who had eventually run off somewhere in Indian Territory and never been recovered. Thomas Wainwright was not a bad man. He was a tired man, which in the West sometimes amounted to the same thing. He had built a reasonable life in Carterville. He ran a small feed and grain store on the main street, and he was respected in the way that quietly competent, unambitious men are respected. He did not drink to excess or gamble or lose his temper. He also did not particularly notice when his daughter was quietly becoming a woman of exceptional intelligence and capability and spirit, because men like Thomas Wainwright rarely noticed those things in daughters. Maggie had educated herself from the small collection of books that the Carterville schoolteacher, Mrs. Prentice, had been willing to lend. She had read everything she could find. She helped her father in the store, kept the accounts in a neat ledger, could judge the quality of seed corn by looking at it, and could negotiate a price with a rancher or a farmer without ever losing her composure. She had made herself useful in the way women in the West had to make themselves useful, which was in every possible direction at once. She had also, in the ordinary course of living in a small town, become known as the most capable woman in Carterville, which should have been a point of pride but frequently functioned instead as a reason for men to admire her without committing to her, because capable women made some men nervous. It was simpler to court the pretty, uncomplicated girls, the ones who would not look at your ledger and tell you that your accounts were off by $17. Daniel Greer had been different, or so Maggie had believed. Daniel was the son of Henry Greer, who owned the largest ranch in the county, and who possessed the particular confidence of a man who has never truly suffered. Daniel himself was handsome in a clean, conventional way, with blonde hair and an easy smile, and he had pursued Maggie with a patience and consistency that she had found over time genuinely moving. He came to the store. He brought flowers, which were a somewhat ridiculous gesture in a dusty West Texas town, but which she appreciated for the effort. He talked to her like she was intelligent, or at least he did a convincing impression of it. When he stood in her father's parlor 3 weeks ago and told Thomas Wainwright that he intended to ask for Maggie's hand before the summer, Maggie had been in the next room and she had heard every word. She had pressed her hand against her sternum and felt something warm and final settle into place inside her, the way the last piece of a puzzle settles and you suddenly understand the picture. She had believed it completely. She had been a fool, not because love made her a fool. She refused to accept that particular assessment of herself. She had been a fool because she had trusted a man who turned out to be unworthy of her trust, and those were two entirely different things. The failing was his, even if the pain was hers, but pain has a way of not caring about whose fault it is. In the 3 weeks between Daniel's declaration in the parlor and the spring gathering, something had changed. Maggie had not known what it was. She had noticed that Daniel's visits became slightly less frequent, and that when he came to the store he seemed distracted, quick to leave. She had told herself he was busy with the spring cattle work on his father's ranch. She had told herself all the reasonable things people tell themselves when they are not yet ready to know the unreasonable truth. The truth, as she learned it in the worst possible way at the spring gathering with the fiddle music playing and the paper lanterns swinging, was that Clara Holt had arrived in Carterville 6 weeks ago to stay with her cousin. And Clara Holt was very beautiful and very easy and very uncomplicated. And Daniel Greer had apparently found these qualities deeply appealing in a way that overrode every promise he had half made to Maggie Wainwright. She had heard 2 women talking about it near the food tables before she saw it herself. She had walked away from the food tables and found the fence post and sat down and put her hands flat against her knees and decided that she would survive this. And then the fiddle player had launched into a reel, and she had looked up and there was Daniel, spinning Clara Holt in the firelight, laughing. That was when Milton Donovan began crossing the field. He did not know Maggie Wainwright. He had been in Carterville for 2 days, and he had spent most of those 2 days out on the northern range checking fence line for the Callaway outfit. He had come to the gathering because the cook at the bunkhouse had told him there would be good food and decent company, and Milton Donovan was a man who appreciated both. He was standing with the ranchers near the bonfire, holding a tin cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, only half listening to a conversation about the new railroad spur that was supposed to come through by autumn, when he saw her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she was dramatic or conspicuous. She was, in fact, doing everything possible to be neither of those things. She was sitting very still at the far edge of the clearing, alone, with her hands pressed against her knees and her chin lifted at an angle that cost her something to maintain. And there was a man in the middle of the clearing dancing with a woman in a blue dress. And every few seconds, in the way that people's eyes move without permission toward the things that hurt them, the woman at the fence post glanced at the dancing couple and then quickly looked away. Milton had seen that specific combination of stillness and pain and controlled dignity exactly once before in his life, and it had been on the face of his own mother the day his father left their home in Missouri and did not come back. He had been 9 years old, and his mother had sat in a chair by the window and pressed her hands flat against her knees and looked out at the road, and the thing that had haunted Milton about that memory for 19 years was not that his father left but that his mother had sat alone in her pain and no one had come to sit with her. He set down his tin cup. He said nothing to the ranchers he was standing with. He crossed the field. The spring gathering continued to swirl around them as Maggie and Milton sat side by side on the fence rail, the fiddle music rising and falling, the paper lanterns making small orange pools of light in the darkening April evening. They were not precisely talking, not exactly. There were long pauses in which neither of them said anything, and the silences were comfortable in a way that surprised Maggie, because she was not a woman who found silences comfortable as a general rule. She told him small things, about the feed store, about her father. She did not say anything more about Daniel Greer, and Milton did not ask. He told her that he had ridden down from Colorado, that he had worked cattle since he was 14, that he had no permanent address, which he said with a flatness that suggested he had made a certain peace with this fact, though the peace was not total. "You just ride from ranch to ranch?" she asked. "I do," he said. "The Callaway outfit is good work for a season, maybe longer." "What are you looking for?" she asked, and then felt immediately that it was too forward a question, too personal for a conversation with a stranger. But Milton Donovan did not seem to find it too personal. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark field beyond the gathering. "I'll let you know when I find it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was neither flirtatious nor evasive but simply honest, and Maggie found it disarming in a way that irritated her slightly, because she had decided approximately 37 minutes ago that she was not going to allow herself to be disarmed by any man for a very long time. He walked her home that night. She had not asked him to. He had simply fallen into step beside her when she rose from the fence rail and said she was going, and she had not told him not to. They walked the 3 blocks from the gathering field to the front gate of the Wainwright house, and the night air was cool and smelled of cedar and wood smoke and new grass, and Maggie told herself that she was allowing this only because it was practical, and she was not a woman who refused practical things. At the gate she turned and held out her hand in the way she had seen men shake hands, and Milton Donovan looked at it for a moment and then shook it, very solemnly, and his hand was rough and warm. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For crossing the field," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. In the dim light from the house windows his eyes were unreadable but not unkind. Then he let go of her hand, put his hat on and walked back toward the town. Maggie went inside and climbed to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands against her knees, exactly the same gesture she had used at the fence post, and discovered that the ache in her chest that had been so sharp an hour ago had shifted into something slightly less acute. It was still there. It would be there for some time, but it had moved, and that was something. She did not expect to see Milton Donovan again. She was wrong about that. The next morning he came into her father's feed store to buy 2 50-pound sacks of grain for the Callaway Ranch horses, and he greeted her with a nod and set the money on the counter without making a performance of the coincidence, and Maggie weighed his grain and wrote the sale in the ledger and said, "The road to the Callaway spread goes north out of town, past the big windmill. You'll see the gate." "I know," he said. "I came from there this morning." "Then why are you buying grain here instead of from the Callaway supply?" "Callaway sent me specifically," he said, "because Callaway's usual supplier is shorting the weight on the sacks and your grain is fair." Maggie looked at him for a moment. "How do you know ours is fair?" "I asked around," he said simply. She handed him his receipt. He picked up the grain sacks as if they weighed nothing and carried them out to his horse, a big gray gelding with a quiet temperament, and Maggie watched from behind the counter as he secured them to the saddle and then mounted with the easy, automatic confidence of a man who had been climbing onto horses his entire life. He rode north without looking back. Maggie told herself this was a perfectly ordinary transaction. She had sold grain to hundreds of ranch hands. She returned to her ledger. But she thought about it on and off for the rest of the afternoon, in the way you think about a song you heard once and can't quite identify. He came back 3 days later, not for grain. He walked in, removed his hat, and said that he had noticed on his way in from the range that the hinge on the front door of the store was loose, and if she had a spare hinge and a screwdriver he could fix it in 10 minutes. Maggie stared at him. "The hinge has been loose for 6 months," she said. "I can see that," he said. "Do you have a spare?" She found him a hinge in the back storage room and a screwdriver and stood in the doorway and watched him crouch at the door frame and work with quick, economical movements. And she noticed that he hummed something very quietly while he worked, too quiet to identify the tune but present, like a man who was comfortable enough in his own company to make small sounds in it. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "What do you want in exchange?" She asked, because in her experience men who did things for women without being asked were either hiding something or expecting something. Milton tightened the last screw and stood up and tested the door, which swung clean and smooth on its new hinge. He looked at her. "Nothing," he said. "The door needed fixing." Maggie crossed her arms. "People don't fix things for nothing." "Some do," he said. She studied him with the frank, assessing look she used when she was trying to determine if a bag of seed corn was worth its price. He met her gaze without discomfort, without posturing, without any of the subtle performance men usually engaged in when they wanted something. He simply looked back at her, steady and patient as creek water. "Come have coffee," she said, before she had decided to say it. He did. They sat at the small table in the back room of the store where Maggie kept the ledger and the account books, and she made coffee on the small iron stove, and he took his cup with both hands and they talked for an hour. They talked about everything and nothing, about the new railroad coming, about the drought that had ended last fall, about the state of the grass on the northern range, about a book she was reading, a thick history of the Republic of Texas that Mrs. Prentice had found somewhere, and about which Milton knew rather more than she expected, having grown up in Missouri, where Texas history was taught with a particular mixture of admiration and suspicion. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape when you are traveling through it slowly. He had 2 brothers still in Missouri, both farmers. His father had left when he was 9 and had never been heard from again. His mother had died 4 years ago of pneumonia, and he had not been there because he had been in Colorado and the letter had taken 3 weeks to reach him. He said this last thing without self-pity, but Maggie heard what was underneath it, the particular guilt of a person who was far away when they should not have been. "Why did you leave Missouri?" she asked. He turned his cup in his hands. Too much of the past in the ground there, he said. My mother's buried there, the farm my father abandoned is there. I could stand in any field in that county and see nothing but the shape of things I couldn't fix. He paused. Out here, at least the distances are honest. You can see how far you've come. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Or how far you have to go, she said. That too, he agreed. Thomas Wainwright came in from the main floor of the store at that point, and found a man he did not know sitting at the back table with his daughter, and Maggie watched her father's expression perform several quick calculations before settling on cautious civility. Milton stood immediately and extended his hand and introduced himself, and Thomas shook it and asked 2 or 3 careful questions about his work at the Callaway Ranch in the tone of a man who was trying to be fair, but had a father's natural instinct toward suspicion. Milton answered everything directly, without flattery or evasion. Thomas eventually sat down and had a cup of coffee himself, and by the time Milton left, Maggie could see that her father had decided, provisionally, that this was a decent man. Thomas Wainwright had made his living for 30 years reading people in quality and equal measure, and he was rarely wrong. After Milton had gone, Thomas Wainwright sat for a moment looking at the door. Where did you meet him? He asked. The spring gathering, Maggie said. He sat with me. Thomas nodded slowly. He looked at the new hinge on the front door, then at his daughter. He said nothing more because Thomas Wainwright was not a man who talked about feelings, but Maggie saw something in his expression that she recognized, something she might have called relief, though she was not sure what precisely he was relieved about. She was not sure she was ready to wonder about that yet. The weeks that followed the spring gathering moved in the particular way that time moves in a small West Texas town in late spring, which is to say that it moved slowly in the large sense and very fast in the small one. The days were long and hot and full of ordinary work and ordinary talk, and the world was busy with the specific business of existence. But underneath the ordinariness, in Maggie's experience of those weeks, something was accumulating. Something was building in the way that weather builds on the horizon, too gradual to point to in any single moment, but unmistakably present. Milton came to the store every 4 or 5 days, sometimes on store business for the Callaway Ranch, sometimes for reasons that were increasingly difficult to classify as business. He helped Thomas move 300 pounds of seed sacks from the back of the store to the front in preparation for the spring planting rush. He repaired the second hinge on a different door that Maggie had not mentioned, but that he noticed was failing. He sat at the back table and drank coffee and talked to her while she did the accounts, and she discovered that talking to Milton Donovan while she did the accounts was somehow both more distracting and more productive than working in silence, which was logically contradictory, and which she chose not to examine too closely. She learned in these weeks that he was funny in a very dry way that you had to be paying attention to catch. He did not make jokes so much as he made observations that were precisely accurate, and that, by virtue of their precision, were often hilarious. She laughed more than she was accustomed to laughing, and the laughing felt like something coming loose inside her that had been wound too tight. She also learned that he was watching over her in ways she had not asked him to and had not noticed at first. She learned this on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-May when Daniel Greer came into the store. Maggie had known this would happen eventually. Carterville was a small town. Daniel would need grain or seed or something that he could technically have gotten somewhere else, but that would require an extra trip, and convenience would win over discomfort, and he would walk through her door, and they would have to speak to each other in a civil fashion, and the whole thing would be mortifying in a quiet, contained way, and then it would be over. She had prepared herself for this. She had not prepared herself for the fact that Daniel would bring Clara Holt with him. They came in together, Clara hanging on his arm with the particular airlessness of a woman who has not yet learned that public displays of possession are not the same thing as actual security. Daniel looked, to his credit, uncomfortable. He removed his hat. He said, "Maggie," in a voice that was an attempt at casualness and failed. "Daniel," Maggie said, "what can I get for you?" She kept her voice even. She kept her hands on the counter. She kept her face in the neutral, professional expression she had developed over years of dealing with difficult customers, which was the expression of a person who is absolutely present but is not going to be moved by anything you do. Clara looked around the store with the wide, slightly unfocused gaze of a woman who finds feed stores slightly beneath her notice. She said something to Daniel in a low voice that Maggie could not hear, and he nodded and said, "20 pounds of flour, Maggie, if you have it." "We have it," Maggie said. She turned to the shelves to find the flour and heard the bell above the front door and heard a man's boots on the floor and heard Milton's voice say, easy and unhurried, "Wainwright, Calloway wants to know if you have any of that barley left from last month." He was at the counter before she turned around. He was looking at her, not at Daniel, and in his eyes there was a question that was not quite a question, a quiet, careful assessment, the same look he had given her at the spring gathering when he had asked if she was all right. Maggie answered with the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. "I am all right." She saw something in his face relax by precisely the same amount that it had tensed. He turned then and noticed Daniel and Clara and said, "Morning," in a tone that was perfectly neutral and completely impenetrable. And Daniel, who had been watching all of this, said, "Morning," back in a tone that had gone slightly wary. Maggie set the flour on the counter and wrote the sale in the ledger, and Daniel paid and left with Clara, and Milton stayed and bought his barley and helped load it into the saddle bags, and neither of them talked about what had just happened. But later, when Maggie was closing up the store for the evening and she was walking home, and she heard someone fall into step beside her, she was not surprised when she turned, and it was Milton. And she was not surprised when she did not tell him to go away. "He hurt you," Milton said, after they had walked half a block in silence. "He did," Maggie said. "Are you angry?" She considered the question seriously because Milton asked questions seriously, and it seemed dishonest to answer them with less care than they deserved. "I was," she said. "Now I am mostly tired of being angry, which is a different thing." "What is it like, being tired of it?" She looked at the darkening street ahead of them. "It's like carrying a stone for a long time and deciding to set it down," she said. "Not because you forgive whoever made you carry it, but because it was always your stone to set down and you're ready." Milton was quiet for a moment. "That's a good way to think about it," he said. "Are you carrying any stones?" she asked. He walked a few steps without answering, and she thought she had overstepped, but then he said, "A few, they're getting lighter." They were at her gate. She stopped and faced him in the pale evening light. "Milton," she said, "why do you keep coming to the store?" He met her gaze. There was no evasion in him, no performance. He said, "Because I want to see you." "Why?" she asked, and she was not asking to be coy or to hear a flattery she could dismiss. She was asking because she genuinely needed to understand, because she had been wrong about a man before, and the wrongness had cost her something she intended not to lose twice. He took his time with the answer. This was something she had come to recognize about him, that he took his time with things that mattered, not because he was slow but because he took them seriously. "Because you are the most honest person I have met in a very long time," he said. "Because you don't pretend anything. Because when I sat down beside you at that gathering and you were in real pain and you told me you were fine, I could see the whole truth of the situation in your face, and I thought, this is a person who deserves better than the situation she is in. And I thought I would like to know her." He paused. "That is the truth of it. I don't have a hidden motive. I don't have a secret reason. I just want to know you." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. He walked back to town. Maggie went inside. She pressed her back against the closed door and looked at the ceiling of the entryway and breathed very carefully for a moment, because her heart was doing something alarming and she needed it to stop. It did not stop. The summer came on fast and hot, the way Texas summers do, with a particular kind of heat that has a weight and a texture to it, that presses down on the world and makes everything slow and concentrated. The work at the feed store was steady, the spring planting rush giving way to the long mid-season management of crops and livestock, and Maggie was busy from the time the store opened to the time it closed, which was a mercy because busy was better than still when you were trying not to think too hard about certain things. She and Milton fell into a rhythm that neither of them had arranged or discussed. He came on Tuesdays and Fridays, sometimes on Sundays after the service, and they talked in the back room or they walked in the evening. And occasionally Thomas came along on the walks, which Maggie appreciated because it meant the whole thing was properly chaperoned, and she did not have to worry about what the town was saying, or not so much anyway. What the town was saying was considerable. Carterville was a small town with limited entertainment, and the story of Maggie Wainwright being abandoned by Daniel Greer and subsequently spending time with a ranch hand from the Callaway outfit was the kind of material that small towns find absolutely irresistible. Opinion was divided. Some women thought it was too fast, that Maggie was clearly trying to make Daniel jealous. Some thought Milton Donovan was not enough for her, being a working ranch hand with no land and no prospects. Some thought it was the most sensible thing in the world, and these were generally the women who knew Maggie best. Mrs. Prentice, who had lent Maggie books for 7 years and who was therefore perhaps the person in Carterville who knew Maggie's mind most accurately, said to her over tea in late June, "He looks at you like he's actually paying attention. That's rarer than you'd think." "He is paying attention," Maggie said. "Does it frighten you?" Maggie thought about this. "A little," she said. "After Daniel," Mrs. Prentice nodded. "That's sensible. Fear keeps you from being stupid, but it shouldn't keep you from being happy." She poured more tea. "The question is whether the fear is protecting you from a real danger or from a real feeling. Those require different responses." Maggie went home and lay on her bed and looked at the ceiling and decided that Mrs. Prentice was, as usual, correct. The real danger, she had come to understand after months of careful observation, was not Milton Donovan. Milton Donovan was, as far as she could determine, exactly what he presented himself as. He was not hiding a dark past of criminal enterprise. He was not married elsewhere. He was not pursuing her for her father's business or his family's land. He was a man who worked hard and said what he meant and had more losses in his history than his age strictly warranted, and who had decided, for reasons she now believed she understood, that she was worth crossing a field for. The real danger was her own heart, which had been wrong before and which had not entirely recovered from being wrong, and which was now making very strong arguments in a direction she was not sure she was ready to go. She was 23 years old. She had lived in West Texas for 7 years. She had kept accounts and managed a store and educated herself from borrowed books and survived the loss of her mother and the quiet, grinding loneliness of a life that was full of purpose but had, until recently, been somewhat empty of joy. She had thought she understood what she wanted and needed, and she had been badly wrong. She was afraid to be badly wrong again. But she was also, she realized on a night in early July when Milton took her to the high meadow north of town to watch the summer lightning moving across the plain below them. She was also desperately tired of being afraid. They were sitting on a flat rock at the edge of the meadow. The lightning was distant and silent from this far away, great white sheets of it illuminating the underside of far clouds, and the sky above them was clear and dense with stars. Milton was sitting beside her with his elbows on his knees, his hat beside him on the rock, and his dark hair was loose around his face in the warm night wind. "Milton," she said. "Yes." "Do you intend to stay in Carterville?" He turned to look at her. The lightning lit the southern sky and his face was in profile for a moment, sharp and clear. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether there is a reason to." She looked at the stars. Her heart was doing the alarming thing again. "I think," she said very carefully, "that there might be a reason." She heard him breathe. He was quiet for a long moment. Maggie, he said, and the way he said her name was different from any way anyone had ever said it, not with Daniel's easy assumption or her father's fondness, but with something that she could only describe as deliberateness, as if her name was a word he had chosen very carefully. "Yes," she said. "May I hold your hand?" It was such a simple thing to ask. It was such an unexpectedly straightforward, uncomplicated, honest thing to ask, with no hidden motive and no performance and no game, just a direct question put to her with the full expectation that she was capable of answering it. She reached over and put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with the same quiet certainty with which he did everything, and they sat on the flat rock above the plain and watched the summer lightning move in the south, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the silence was the most comfortable silence Maggie Wainwright had ever sat in. After that night, things changed. Not dramatically, not in the way of sudden declarations and swept-off-her-feet gestures, but in the slow, sure way of things that are real, the way a river changes the land it runs through, not all at once but continuously over time, until one day you look and the landscape is different. He took her out to see the Callaway Ranch on a Saturday in July, because she had said she wanted to understand what his work actually looked like, and he had taken her word for it and arranged with old Earl Callaway for the visit. Earl Callaway was a large, weathered man of 60 with a genuine interest in people and a tendency to talk at length about cattle management, and he showed Maggie around with obvious pride, while Milton saddled 2 horses for the afternoon ride. They rode the northern range for 2 hours in the late afternoon heat, and Milton showed her the fence line he maintained, and the water sources he checked, and the places where the grass was changing, and what that meant for the cattle's movement. He explained it all with the same patience and precision he brought to everything, and she asked questions and he answered them, and by the time they turned back toward the ranch house she understood the shape of his daily life in a way that felt important. "You love this," she said as they walked the horses back along the creek. He thought about it. "I love the work," he said. "I love knowing how to do something well and doing it. The land itself is," he paused, "the land here is hard, but it's honest. You can't fool it." "Is that what you're looking for?" she asked. "Things you can't fool." He glanced at her with something that might have been surprise and might have been recognition. "Maybe," he said. "Or things that can't fool me." She understood exactly what he meant. On the ride back she drew her horse alongside his and they rode that way, side by side, not talking much, and the late sun turned the grass golden and the shadows of the cedar trees were long and blue across the ground, and Maggie thought that if this was what it looked like, this specific thing, this afternoon on this land beside this man, then perhaps she was not going to be afraid of it anymore. July became August, and August was brutal the way only a Texas August can be brutal, with a heat that has intentions. The town moved slowly, and people were short-tempered, and the creek dropped to half its usual level, and the cattle on all the surrounding ranches began to lose condition in a way that worried everyone. But the heat also simplified things. In the heat, in the long evenings when the day's work was finally done, and the air was still warm but the sun had dropped below the range of hills to the west, Milton and Maggie often sat on the front step of the Wainwright house and talked while the stars came out, and the heat seemed to have burned away whatever reserve had remained between them. They talked about everything, about what he wanted, about what she wanted, about the future in the direct, pragmatic way that people in the West talked about the future, which was not dreaming exactly but planning, making calculations about the possible. She had told him about her mother. He had told her more about his father. She had told him about the loneliness of the years in Carterville, the particular loneliness of being smart and capable and female in a place that did not always know what to do with those qualities. He had told her about Colorado and the years of working one ranch after another, the specific freedom and specific emptiness of a life with no fixed place in it. "What would you do," she asked one evening, "if you had land of your own?" He was quiet a moment. "Build something," he said, A proper house, good fence, breed the horses right. He looked at his hands. Start a remuda. There's money in good horses trained right. The army is always needing horses. The ranches are always needing horses. Do you know horses well enough? Yes, he said, without any particular pride but with absolute certainty. She looked at his profile in the last of the evening light. There is land north of the Callaway spread, she said. About 300 acres. It's been filed on and abandoned twice. The title is complicated but not impossible. He turned to look at her. How do you know that? Because I read the county land records when I have time, she said, and I find the patterns interesting. He stared at her. Then he laughed, a real full laugh, the kind she did not hear from him often enough, and the sound of it moved through her like clean water. Of course you do, he said. I could help you understand the title situation, she offered, if you were interested. He was still smiling, but his expression had gone from amused to something more serious. Maggie, he said, are you suggesting I should try to buy that land? I'm suggesting that 300 acres of decent grass with water access and a view of the northern range might be worth looking into for a man who knows horses and is thinking about building something, she said. I'm also suggesting that a man who is thinking about building something might want to have the rest of his thinking clear before he talks to the county land office. He looked at her for a long moment. The rest of my thinking, he said slowly, is very clear. Is it? She said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was not. Maggie Wainwright, he said, and he turned fully toward her, and he was serious now in the way that mattered, in the way that required her full attention. I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it right. She waited. I am a man with a small amount of savings and a good reputation and a skill with horses and a serious intention, he said. I am not a wealthy man, and I cannot offer you what Daniel Greer could have offered you in the way of immediate comfort. But I can offer you honesty and constancy and the intention to build something real, and I can offer you the certainty that I will never, not once, make you sit alone at a fence post in front of the entire town because I was too small a person to keep my word. He paused. I would like to court you properly, with your father's knowledge, with the intention of marrying you if you'll have me, but only if you want it, only if you're not afraid. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. The stars were fully out now. The evening air carried the smell of cedar and dust and the faint sweetness of the wild plum thickets along the creek. I am afraid, she said. He nodded, as if this was a reasonable answer. But I think the fear is the wrong kind, she said. The kind Mrs. Prentice says you shouldn't let keep you from being happy. Something in his face broke open in the best possible way. Is that a yes? He asked. That is a yes, she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it on the night of the summer lightning, with the same quiet certainty, and they sat on the front step with the stars above them and the darkness soft around them. And Maggie Wainwright thought that this was what it felt like to make a decision with your whole self. Not just the part of you that was hopeful, but the part that was careful too, the part that had learned to ask hard questions and wait for honest answers. This was what it felt like to be right. Thomas Wainwright gave his blessing the following evening, without a great deal of preamble. He shook Milton's hand and looked at him steadily for a moment and then nodded once in the way that Thomas Wainwright nodded when he had assessed something and found it sound. You'll need land, Thomas said. I'm looking into it, Milton said. Thomas nodded again. My daughter has found land, he said without inflection. She has, Milton said. She is extremely good at finding things. Thomas's expression shifted slightly in the direction of something that was not quite a smile but was related to one. She is, he agreed. Takes after her mother. He looked at Maggie. Your mother would have liked him. Maggie pressed her lips together for a moment. I know, she said. The land question turned out to be as complicated as Maggie had suggested, and was resolved with somewhat more difficulty than either of them had anticipated. But it was resolved because Maggie Wainwright's ability to read a land title and identify the path of least resistance through legal complexity was, it turned out, a formidable skill. The title to the northern property had been filed on originally in 1876 by a man named Josiah Pratt who had subsequently died of cholera. His estate had never been properly probated in Hale County, and a second filing made in 1879 by a rancher named Cuthbert had lapsed when Cuthbert left the territory. Maggie wrote to the county clerk's office and to a lawyer in Abilene and spent 3 weeks reading documents and writing careful letters, and at the end of it she presented Milton with a clear path to acquire the title through a legitimate claim process that would take approximately 4 months to finalize. "How do you know all this?" he asked, looking at the documents spread across the back table of the store. "I read," she said. "You read land law in Texas for pleasure." "I read everything for knowledge," she corrected. "Knowledge is useful." He looked at her with an expression she was coming to recognize as his specific version of wonder, which was less open-mouthed than most people's but was present in his eyes in a way that she found, she admitted to herself, deeply satisfying. Milton had saved enough money to make the filing fee and the first year's assessment. The 300 acres were his by October of 1881, pending the 4-month completion of the claim process. Earl Calloway, who was a practical man and recognized both good work and opportunity when he saw it, agreed to keep Milton on through the winter and spring in exchange for help breaking the first string of horses that would be Milton's foundation stock, which Calloway purchased on Milton's behalf against future payment at fair prices. The wedding was set for March of 1882. Maggie had very specific ideas about her wedding, which she communicated to Milton and to her father and to Mrs. Prentice with the same clear precision she brought to everything. She wanted it in the church, not in someone's yard. She wanted wildflowers, not the hothouse varieties that had to be ordered from Abilene. She wanted the whole town invited, not a select crowd, because she was not going to make her happiness small or private or apologetic. She had sat alone at a fence post at the spring gathering, and she had been found by a man worth being found by, and she was going to celebrate this in front of every person in Carterville who had watched her sit there. The wedding took place on a Saturday in mid-March of 1882, on a day that had the clear, cool, gold-tinged perfection that West Texas occasionally produces in early spring, as if the weather had decided to make an exception. The church was full. Every woman in Carterville who could hold a wildflower had brought one, and the pews were fragrant with early Texas bluebonnets and yellow coneflowers, and the white blooms of the antelope horn milkweed that grew along the roadsides. Maggie walked down the aisle on her father's arm in a dress she had made herself from white lawn cotton that Mrs. Prentice had helped her trim with lace that had come all the way from San Antonio in a mail-order package. She wore her mother's small gold brooch at her collar. Her hair was up and her back was straight, and she looked at Milton waiting for her at the front of the church with the expression of a woman who has made a decision with her whole self and is not afraid of it. Milton was wearing his best coat, which was dark wool and had been recently pressed, and he had shaved, and his dark hair was tamed into something approximating order, and he was looking at her coming toward him with an expression that did not attempt to hide anything. He looked like a man who was looking at exactly what he had crossed a field for. He looked like a man who had found what he was looking for. The Reverend Aldrich married them in 20 minutes of plain, honest words, and Maggie Wainwright became Maggie Donovan in front of the whole town of Carterville. And when Milton kissed her, quiet and certain, the way he did everything, the church broke into a sound that was part applause and part the specific communal exhale of a room full of people who have been invested in a story and have seen it resolve well. Outside in the clear March sunlight, Mrs. Prentice pressed Maggie's hands and said, "Your mother would have been very proud." Maggie pressed back. "I know," she said. "I think she would have liked him enormously. She would have approved of a man who fixes hinges, Mrs. Prentice said sagely, and Maggie laughed, and it was a good laugh, the kind that carries the weight of real feeling. The reception was held in the church yard and then in the field beside the church, the same field where the spring gathering had been held a year ago, the same field Milton had crossed with his hat in his hand to ask a woman sitting alone if she was all right, and this was not a coincidence. Maggie had chosen the location on purpose, and Milton had understood why when she told him, and he had said nothing except that he was glad he had crossed it. Thomas Wainwright ate too much and drank a modest quantity of beer and sat in a chair, and watched his daughter laugh in the late afternoon light with a kind of satisfied quietness that was about the closest he ever got to joy. Daniel Greer and Clara Holt, who were by then engaged to each other with varying degrees of mutual enthusiasm, were both present because the whole town was present, and Maggie had insisted on the whole town. Daniel shook Milton's hand with the complicated grace of a man who knows he behaved badly and is trying to behave better now, and Milton shook back without making anything of it, because Milton Donovan was not a man who needed to make things of other people's failings. Maggie watched this from across the yard and thought, not for the last time, that she had been the luckiest kind of fool, the kind whose foolishness leads them, accidentally, exactly where they should have been going. They moved into a rented house on the north side of Carterville for the winter while Milton worked the Callaway horses, and the land claim processed through the county offices. The house was small and had a leaky corner of roof that Milton patched within the first week, and a garden plot that the previous tenant had started and abandoned, and a front room that got excellent morning light. Maggie continued to work at her father's store because they needed the income, and because she was good at it, and because she had no intention of giving up a thing she was good at simply because she was now married. Milton had no objection to this. He had never, not once, suggested that Maggie's capabilities were something she should diminish for anyone's comfort, including his own. When she stayed late at the store working through a complicated bulk order from one of the larger ranches, he came by at closing time and walked her home and made dinner, which was simple but competent, in the same way he did everything. He was not a man who required managing or maintaining. He was a man who simply got on with things, and in the getting on with things made space for her to get on with hers. They fought twice that winter, with the specific intensity of two people who are both direct and strong-willed, and who are still learning the shape of each other's limits. The first fight was about money, specifically about how much of their combined savings to commit to the first full fence on the northern land. Milton wanted to do it all at once. Maggie wanted to stage it in 2 phases and keep a reserve for unexpected expenses. They argued for an hour with the kind of specificity that the argument deserved, both citing actual numbers, and then Maggie's calculation proved to be correct when the lumber costs came in 20% higher than estimated, and Milton acknowledged this without drama and said, "You were right," and Maggie said, "You will probably be right next time," and that was the end of it. The second fight was harder. It was about the dark past that Milton carried, which he had mentioned in pieces over the months they had known each other, but which she had not fully understood until the night in February when he woke up from a dream with his jaw clenched and his hands fisted, and could not explain it to her in any of the ways she was used to people explaining things, because the territory he was in was not territory he had maps for. His father leaving had done something to Milton that was not a simple or straightforward wound. It had left him with a particular kind of vigilance about being someone who stayed, about being reliable and present and worthy of the trust placed in him. That was mostly a good quality and occasionally tipped over into something harder, a severity with himself, an internal requirement that he be enough in ways that no one could quite define. He had been carrying this without knowing he was carrying it, the way people carry the heaviest things, by simply building their whole body around the weight. Maggie found him sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, and she sat down across from him and she said, "Tell me what you are thinking." He looked at her. He said, "I am thinking about what kind of man I am and whether it is the right kind." "That is a very broad question," she said. "Can you make it smaller?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am thinking about whether I am going to be the kind of man who stays." Maggie looked at him steadily. "Have you left?" she asked. "No." "Have you wanted to?" He shook his head. "Then the thinking seems like a form of worrying," she said, "about something that is not actually happening." He rubbed his face with his hands. "My father is not you," she said firmly. "Your father's choices are not your inheritance unless you decide they are. You are a man who crossed an entire field to ask a woman he did not know if she was all right. That is not the character of a man who leaves." He looked at her. "That is the character of a man who shows up," she said. "And you have been showing up, Milton, every time. Don't borrow trouble from a past that isn't yours." He was quiet for a very long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "You are the clearest person I have ever known," he said. "Someone has to be," she said, and the tension broke, and they sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning and drank the tea she made and talked until the darkness outside the window began to go gray. And by the time they went back to bed, something had shifted in him in the same way the stone had shifted in her. Something set down that had been carried too long. He never had that particular dream again, or if he did not wake with his hands fisted. The land claim finalized in April of 1882, 1 year after the spring gathering. Milton signed the papers in the county clerk's office in Carterville with Maggie sitting beside him, and when it was done, he was the legal owner of 312 acres of West Texas grass north of the Callaway Spread, with water access to the creek and a view of the northern range that on a clear day stretched to the edge of sight. They broke ground on the house that summer. It was not a grand house. It was a solid house, built with intention. Milton did much of the labor himself, helped by Earl Callaway's ranch hands on weekends, and by Thomas Wainwright, who was, it turned out, more useful with a hammer than Maggie had ever known, having apparently spent his youth building things before the farming years had made him mostly sedentary. Maggie designed the house. She drew the plans herself on paper she bought at the general store, measured twice with a cloth tape, and revised 3 times until the rooms were proportioned the way she wanted them. She designed a kitchen with good light and generous counter space, and room for a proper iron stove. She designed a front room with built-in shelves along one wall, which she intended to fill with books over time, starting with the one she had been borrowing from Mrs. Prentice for 7 years and could now, for the first time, acquire as her own. She also designed a small additional room at the back of the house, connected to the main bedroom, that she did not explain to Milton until she showed him the plans, and he looked at it and looked at her and said, "Is that a nursery?" "Not yet," she said. "Eventually." He looked at her with the expression she now thought of simply as his face when he was looking at her, the specific attention he paid to her that was different from any attention she had ever received, the attention of a person who is genuinely interested in who you are. "Maggie Donovan," he said. "Milton Donovan," she said back. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I know," she said, and she was not being immodest. She was simply agreeing with an accurate assessment, and he laughed, and that laugh still moved through her like clean water after all this time. They moved into the house in October of 1882. It was not finished in all the details, some of the interior walls still wanting plaster, the bookshelves not yet complete, the garden plot not yet fully broken in, but it was solid and weathertight, and it was theirs, and the moving in was one of the most quietly significant days of Maggie's life. She stood in the kitchen in the late afternoon light and looked out the window at the northern range and thought about Louise Wainwright, who had died in Kansas in the winter cold, who had wanted a real house with a real kitchen and had never quite managed it. Maggie pressed her hand against the counter and made a private promise that she would not waste this, that she would fill this house with intention and care, and the kind of steady, ordinary joy that does not get written about much because it is not dramatic, but that is in fact the material the good years are made of. Milton found her there and stood in the kitchen door and watched her, and did not ask what she was thinking, because he had learned to read the quality of her silences, and knew this one was private in a way that didn't need interruption. He came and stood beside her, and they looked out the window together at the range, and the October light was golden, and the grass was the color of honey, and the sky was enormous and blue. "We built this," he said. "We did," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood in the kitchen of their house on their land in the late October light. And outside a hawk made a slow, wide circle over the northern meadow, and the world was large and certain and very, very good. The horse operation grew steadily through the winter of 1882 and into 1883. Milton had a particular gift for it, which Maggie had suspected from the beginning, and which confirmed itself in the quality of the animals he produced. The horses he trained were calm and responsive and willing, with the good manners that came from being handled with patience from birth. And the word spread through the ranching community in the way that the word about quality always spreads, quietly and absolutely, from one man to another, from one outfit to the next. By the spring of 1883, Milton had 4 regular buyers, including Earl Calloway, who purchased exclusively from him now, and a partial contract with a cavalry unit stationed at Fort Concho, who needed remount horses and had been delighted to find a supplier who could deliver animals of consistent quality at fair prices. The contract with Fort Concho required a trip to San Angelo in May. Milton made the trip with 2 of his best horses and came home with the contract signed and a sum of money that was more than they had expected, and he laid the contract on the kitchen table and said nothing and watched Maggie read it. She read it through, carefully, twice. Then she set it down and looked at him. "Milton," she said, "this is the beginning of a real business." "I know," he said. "We need to expand the pasture." "I know." "We need 2 more breeding mares by fall." "I know," he said, and he was smiling. "I know all of this because I have been thinking about it for the last 3 days on the road from San Angelo, and I also know the exact cost of everything, and I would like very much to sit down and go through it with you. But first I need coffee, and I need to sit down." She made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table with the contract between them, and went through every figure, every projected cost, every anticipated return, with the specific mutual pleasure of 2 people who both genuinely enjoy this kind of thinking, and who have found in each other a partner who can keep up. It was, Maggie thought, about the most romantic thing she had ever done, and she was aware that this opinion would not be widely shared, but she did not particularly care. The summer of 1883 brought 3 things of consequence. The first was the completion of the bookshelves in the front room, which Milton finished in July on a rainy Saturday when outdoor work was impossible, and which Maggie proceeded to fill over the course of 2 weeks with every book she had been borrowing from Mrs. Prentice and several she ordered through the general store from a catalog, and with seeing those books on those shelves in that room, Maggie felt something settle in her that she realized had been waiting to settle for a very long time. She had her own library, in her own house. This was, she decided, one of the finest things she had ever accomplished. The second thing of consequence was the arrival of Thomas Wainwright at their door one Sunday morning, with the news that he intended to sell the feed store and retire, as his joints were troubling him, and he was 61 years old, and had been on his feet for 30 years, and he was, he said, simply done. He said this with the equanimity of a man who has made a practical decision and is at peace with it, but Maggie could see the tiredness in him that lay behind the equanimity, and she was glad he had said it. She hugged him, which surprised him, because she was not a woman who hugged easily, and he patted her back with the careful tenderness of a man who loves his daughter and doesn't quite know how to say so, and then he ate breakfast at her table and played 2 games of checkers with Milton and went home. He moved into the small additional room they had prepared at the back of the house in August, the room that was not yet a nursery, and it turned out to be just right for Thomas Wainwright, who was a quiet man who did not need much space but who needed, it became clear, not to be alone. He sat on the front porch in the evenings and watched Milton work the horses in the paddock, and sometimes he helped with small tasks that did not require much walking, and he taught Maggie's mother's recipes to Maggie on rainy days when they had nothing else to press. And in this way the house became something larger than just a couple and their work. It became a family, assembled from what was left after the losses, which was how most things in the West were built. The third thing of consequence in the summer of 1883 was that Maggie began to understand that the small room at the back of the house was going to need to serve two purposes for a while, and in November she told Milton. She told him simply in the kitchen over breakfast because that was how she told him everything. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the spring." Milton set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, or not exactly, something that was larger than his usual quiet certainty, something that had the quality of a man standing at the edge of a vast plain and understanding for the first time the full size of it. "Maggie," he said. "Yes," she said. He got up from the table and he came around it and he held her with the particular careful strength of a man who has just understood that the thing he is holding contains more than he previously comprehended, and she put her arms around him and felt him breathing. "Are you frightened?" she asked, because she thought he should be asked. "Yes," he said, "and I am glad." "Both things," she agreed. "Both things," he confirmed. Thomas Wainwright, when told, sat quietly for a moment and then said, "Good," in a voice that contained 30 years of missing his wife and 7 years of worrying about his daughter and a future he had not been sure he would live to see. And then he said, "I'll make the rocking chair. I used to be able to make furniture. I expect I still can." He did make the rocking chair, and it was not perfect, being a little uneven on one rocker, but it was solid and it was made with love. And Maggie put it in the small room and sat in it sometimes in the evenings and rocked slowly and looked out the window at the northern range and thought about her mother and about Thomas and about Milton and about the life they had built from a conversation at a fence post on a spring evening. And the thinking was good. The kind of thinking that does not hurt but simply expands, like the sky when you are riding north and the world opens up before you. The baby was born in April of 1884, which was, not lost on Maggie or on Milton, almost exactly 3 years after the spring gathering where he had crossed a field to ask if she was all right. It was a boy, born in the early morning after a long night, with Milton holding Maggie's hand through the whole of it in the quiet, fierce way he held things that mattered, without making noise or complaint or performance. Mrs. Prentice served as the midwife because the doctor was 20 miles away, and Mrs. Prentice had delivered approximately 40 babies in her years in Carterville and was entirely unperturbed by the business of bringing life into the world. The boy arrived with dark hair like his father and blue-gray eyes that Maggie's mother had also had, and he announced himself to the world with a substantial amount of noise that went on for some time before settling into a watchful, very alert silence, the kind that suggested he was already paying close attention. They named him Thomas Edwin Donovan, for Maggie's father, and for Milton's brother Edwin in Missouri, who was the one brother Milton had stayed in any kind of correspondence with. Thomas Sr., upon being told that the baby shared his name, said, "Good," in exactly the same tone he had used when told about the pregnancy, except that this time his voice broke very slightly on the single syllable, and then he went out to the porch to look at the morning and did not come back inside for some time. Milton held his son for the first time with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything, his large hands careful and sure around the small body, and he looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Maggie. "Are you all right?" He asked her, and there was so much in the question, the same question he had asked at the fence post on the spring evening, the question that had been the beginning of everything. She was exhausted and sore and happier than she had ever been in her life. "I am all right," she said. "I am very all right." He brought the baby to her and she took him, and Thomas Edwin Donovan looked at his mother with his newly opened eyes that were trying to understand what they were seeing. And Maggie looked back at him and understood exactly what she was seeing, which was the continuation of something, the thing that comes after the hard part, the particular ordinary miracle of the life you built when you stopped being afraid. The years that followed built upon themselves in the way that good years do, each one adding something to the structure of what they were making. The horse operation continued to grow. Milton's reputation spread through the region and then beyond it, and by 1886 he had a waiting list for trained horses and was selling to buyers from 3 states. He hired 2 ranch hands of his own, young men he trained with the same patience he brought to the horses, and the paddocks expanded, and the pasture fences moved outward as he acquired the additional grazing rights he needed. Thomas Edwin Donovan, called Tom from the time he could walk, was an energetic and extremely opinionated small person who showed an early and passionate interest in horses that his father found deeply satisfying and that his mother found entirely predictable. He followed Milton around the paddocks from the time his legs were long enough to manage the uneven ground without falling, and Milton talked to him about the horses with the same seriousness he would have used with an adult, explaining what he was looking for and why, and Tom listened with the particular focused attention of a child who is being treated as capable, which is the best possible environment for producing a child who is capable. Maggie continued to read and to teach, unofficially, whatever she could. Mrs. Prentice had retired from the schoolteacher position in 1885, and the new teacher, a young man named Harris who had come from Dallas, was competent enough but had a somewhat limited view of what girls were worth teaching, a view that Maggie dealt with through the provision of a steady supply of books to every female student in Carterville whose family she knew, and through a quiet, persistent, irresistible pressure on the school board to expand the curriculum, which she exercised through a combination of charm and the same inexorable logical precision she used on everything. She also, by 1886, had a second child, a daughter this time, born in the spring with red hair that came from somewhere in Maggie's ancestry that no one could immediately identify, and a temperament that combined Maggie's directness with Milton's patience in a ratio that suggested she was going to be a remarkable person. They named her Louise, for Maggie's mother. Thomas Sr., who was 70 by then and moving slowly but still making himself useful in small ways around the property, sat in his rocking chair and held his granddaughter and looked out at the northern range and said nothing for a very long time, and Maggie stood in the doorway and watched him and understood. Milton found her in the doorway. "You're thinking about your mother," he said. "I am thinking about how much she would have loved all of this," Maggie said. "The house, the land, the children, you." She turned to look at him. "She would have loved you specifically. She liked people who fix things." "Is that what I do?" he asked. "Among other things," she said. He came and stood beside her in the doorway, and they looked at Thomas Wainwright in the rocking chair with baby Louise. And outside, the late afternoon sun was on the northern range, and the horses moved in the paddock with the slow, easy grace of well-cared-for animals. And the world was, in this specific moment, everything it was supposed to be. In the spring of 1887, 6 years after the spring gathering that had begun it all, Carterville held its annual gathering again in the field beside the church, and Maggie and Milton went together with Tom, who was 3 and running everywhere and had to be watched at all times, and baby Louise in a carry sling against Maggie's chest. They moved through the gathering together the way they moved through everything, side by side, comfortable and present, stopping to talk to people they knew and people they were just coming to know. At some point in the evening, when the fiddle players had started and the dancing couples were circling in the firelight, and the paper lanterns were swinging in the April wind exactly as they had been 6 years ago, Maggie paused at the edge of the clearing and looked out at the field. The fence post she had sat at was still there, somewhat more weathered now. The grass was the same dry April grass. The cottonwood trees were a bit taller. She felt Milton come to stand beside her. "You thinking about it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He looked at the fence post for a moment. "You were the stillest person I had ever seen," he said. "Sitting there, most people when they're hurting they move around, they busy themselves. You just sat completely still, and it was the most," he paused, searching for the word, "the most present thing I had ever seen. Like you were refusing to be anywhere else except exactly where you were." "I was trying to hold myself together," she said. "I know," he said. But it looked like courage. She looked at him. Crossing the whole field looked like courage from my side. He shook his head. That was easy, he said. The decision was easy. I saw someone who needed someone to show up, and I showed up. He put his arm around her, gently, mindful of Louise in the sling. The harder thing was everything after, hoping you would let me. She leaned into him. Around them the gathering continued, the fiddle music rising and the lanterns swaying and the town of Carterville moving in its comfortable social patterns. And Tom was somewhere behind them demanding to be allowed to chase the dogs that were running around the edges of the clearing. And the evening was warm and smelled of cedar smoke and wild plum blossom. I am glad you crossed it, she said. So am I, he said. Baby Louise made a small sound of agreement or complaint. It was difficult to tell which. And Milton reached over and adjusted the sling with the competent one-handed gesture of a man who had been helping with babies long enough to develop a technique. And Louise settled and was quiet. Tom came running back and grabbed Milton's other hand and demanded to be swung, and Milton swung him, once, laughing, and Tom shrieked with delight, and the sound carried out over the spring gathering into the April dark, pure and clean and glad. Maggie looked out at the field where it had all begun. The fence post, the distant cottonwoods, the same dry April grass under the same enormous Texas sky. She thought about who she had been sitting at that fence post, the woman with her hands pressed flat against her knees and her chin lifted at an angle that cost her something to maintain, refusing to cry, surviving the way she always survived, quietly and alone. And she thought about who she was standing here now, with her husband's arm around her and her daughter against her chest, and her son swinging from her husband's hand in the firelight, with land and horses and a house with bookshelves, and a rocking chair made by her father, with the full, certain, unconditional life she had built from the moment. A stranger had decided that someone ought to come ask. She thought about how close it had all come to not happening, about all the ways a person could miss the thing they needed if the timing was wrong or the courage was short or the pride was in the wrong place. And she thought about how, sometimes, the best things that happen to you are not the things you planned or engineered or pursued, but the things that arrive through someone else's goodness. Someone who sees you sitting alone and thinks the necessary thought, the thought that someone ought to go and ask, and then acts on it. She pressed her hand over Louise's warm, small back. She thought about her mother, who had never quite arrived at this, who had lived and loved and died without the house with the kitchen light or the bookshelves or the land that was hers. She made the promise again, the same promise she had made in the kitchen on the day they moved in, the promise she renewed quietly and privately as often as she thought of it. I will not waste this. Milton looked at her and she looked at him, and in the firelight his eyes were that autumn creek color and they were full of attention, the same attention they had always held for her, the attention of a man who was genuinely, perpetually interested in who she was. She smiled at him. He smiled back, and that was everything. That was the whole of it. Not the dramatic version, not the version with the grand gestures and the swept-off feet moments, but the true version, the version where two people found each other through honesty and patience and the simple, repeated act of showing up, and built something from it that was stronger than anything either of them could have built alone. Tom fell asleep eventually, draped across Milton's shoulder with his dark hair against his father's collar, and his small face slack and trusting in the way that children sleep when they are completely certain of where they are. Milton carried him with one arm and walked beside Maggie through the April evening, and Louise was asleep against Maggie's chest, and the gathering continued behind them in the field where it had always been. Thomas Wainwright was waiting at the house, asleep in the rocking chair on the front porch with a shawl across his knees and his head to one side. He woke when they came through the gate and said, in the slightly confused tone of a man emerging from sleep, "Is the gathering done?" "Not quite," Maggie said. "We brought the children home." He nodded, still gathering himself, and then he looked at the four of them in the porch light, his daughter and his son-in-law and his grandchildren, and the expression on his face was not complicated. It was simply full, in the way of a vessel that has been filled to exactly the right point. "Good," he said. "Come in. It's getting cold." It was not particularly cold. It was a mild April night. But they went in, because that was what he had asked, and the house received them the way it always did, with the smell of wood smoke and the good light from the oil lamps and the bookshelves full in the front room, and the solid, reliable weight of a structure built with intention. Milton put Tom to bed with the careful efficiency of a practiced father. Maggie settled Louise in her cradle and stood over her for a moment in the quiet of the back room, watching her daughter's small chest rise and fall. She went back to the kitchen and made tea and took 2 cups out to the front porch where Milton had joined Thomas, and the 3 of them sat in the April night and drank their tea and did not talk very much, because not very much needed to be said. After a while Thomas went to bed, moving slowly with his cane, and it was just Maggie and Milton on the porch, the way it so often was at the end of the day, sitting in the chairs they had put out there for exactly this purpose. The sky was full of stars. The horses moved quietly in the paddock. The northern range was a dark line against the star-bright sky. Maggie looked out at the range and then at her husband. "Are you happy?" she asked him. He did not answer right away, in the way he never answered right away when the question was serious. He looked out at the land, at the paddock, at the horses, at the enormous sky. "Yes," he said. "Very." "So am I," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it first on the night of the summer lightning 3 years after they met, with the same quiet certainty, as if her hand was something he had found and intended to keep finding, every day, for all the days there were. They sat on the porch of their house on their land under the Texas stars, and the world was large and certain and very good, and the life they had made from one honest question asked across a gathering field was full and real and absolutely, unreservedly theirs. The spring came around again, the way it always did, faithful and indifferent and beautiful, bringing the bluebonnets and the warm winds and the enormous light. And Maggie Donovan, who had been Maggie Wainwright, woke on a morning in April and looked at the ceiling of their bedroom and listened to the horses and the birds and the wind in the cedar trees and the particular silence of a house still sleeping, and felt the weight of her life against her chest, not as a burden but as a presence. Warm and solid and exactly right. She was 29 years old. She had a house and land and a husband who paid attention and 2 children who were becoming themselves in ways she was discovering with daily delight. She had her books and her knowledge and her capacity for making things work, and she had the very specific joy of using all of these things in a life that was genuinely her own. She pressed her hand flat against the quilt, against the warm certainty of where she was. She had come a long way from the fence post. But she thought sometimes that the fence post was not the low point of the story. That the woman who had sat there, hands pressed flat against her knees, chin up, refusing to break, surviving the way she always survived, quietly and without asking for help, that woman had not been at her worst. She had been at her most herself, and it had been enough to be seen. It had been enough that one person looked across a field and thought someone ought to ask, and then walked over and did. Everything that came after had come from that. From a fence post and a question and 2 people who were, in the end, exactly honest enough to find each other. She heard Milton moving in the kitchen, the sound of the stove, the particular domestic music of an ordinary morning beginning. She heard Tom's voice, bright and immediate as a bird, asking about the horses. She got up. She went into the kitchen, and the day began, which was its own kind of miracle, the ordinary one, the best one, the one that keeps arriving as long as you are there to receive it. This was the life she had built. This was the life she had been found into. This was all of it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was hers.